Hi, I'm Gwendolyn Ralston, and I will be discussing the sculptor David Smith and his contributions to modern art through his revolutionizing techniques in not only his sculpture, but in the way he photographed his pieces. Here we see David Smith's Oculus. David Smith was the first to make industrial welding a sustained technique in sculpture. This piece is an example of how post-war industrialization impacted art in the sculpture community specifically. In this piece, we see pieces of metal and other objects welded together. They're all metal-based objects, and these materials were found materials. They were scraps taken from manufacturers. In this, we see an example of an artistic response to new technology, to specifically industrialization, where there's a lot more trash being accumulated, and this is an artistic way that we take that trash and turn it into art. And we still see this nowadays. Is a great example of something that we still see going on today. A lot of people want to take found objects and turn them into art. This piece also shows a variety of different techniques. Smith would have had to approach each individual object differently, and we can see how he experiments with the metal in a unique system for fabricating a sculpture of metal objects. This catches the eye of Greenberg, where Smith is described as Pollock's counterpart in abstract expressionism, to the point that David Smith is seen as the Jackson Pollock of the sculpture community to Greenberg. Not everybody views David Smith the same way or really notices him as much. There's a book that gets published that focuses on other sculptures of the time, and Greenberg releases a huge critique on the book and is really upset that David Smith wasn't mentioned more in it. He was only mentioned a few times in passing, while there's other artists that were mentioned 10-20 times. Greenberg's actually quoted discussing David Smith, saying, "The only other American artist of our time who produces an art capable of withstanding the test of international scrutiny, and which might justify the term major." So we see that this kind of work really catches the eye of Greenberg as he begins to focus on sculpture and really driving for that puritanism in sculpture that we have discussed in other areas of fine art, such as painting. I choose attention to this to show that a key element in David Smith is a style of photography for his work. Something that was important to Smith was nature and landscape. He would take his finished pieces and take them out of his shop. I say shop because that's what he would call it in an interview. One of his children, one of his daughters, said that's what he called it. He didn't call it his studio, it was his shop, which is an interesting way of how he viewed his work. They also discussed that he was very clean in the studio. Instead of having stuff all over where he would clean his workspace to really see the sculpture build from the floor up in a way, and was very meticulous about it, and starters described it to be a factory-like setting instead of an art studio. But he would take his final pieces and put them in open air to photograph them. One of his driving things was nature, and the open air was very important to him, and that's why we see in most, if not all, of the photographs he takes of his artwork is in open air. If it's not zoomed in on the piece itself that we see in some other pieces that aren't totally sculpture that I won't be able to discuss today, but if you do look into him, there are other pieces that aren't sculpture that he does do. He realized the importance of photography and sculpture as a way of reproduction and is quoted from a letter to his art dealer to get them to use additional illustrations in an upcoming catalog, saying reproduction seems to act as first acquaintance and eliminate some of the barriers. He developed a style earlier on for his photographs where he would either do one-on-one shots like we see here, or group several pieces together where he would take thousands of frames, often moving pieces around. We will see an example of that later on. It's more popular in his later work where he does the group photographs, and the images he would all be taken below eye level. In this image specifically is we see David Smith's making note and a copy of the image of where he wants to crop it. In the image prior, we saw the final product of this where the oculus looked to be disconnected, almost floating in the scene. Smith was aware of this and it was purposeful, but his art dealer wasn't too fond of it. They had some letters back and forth, and where she's like, hey, I don't like this, and it looks disconnected from the base, and he responds, Oculus base was meant to be disconnected from the base, hence the unusual elevation. The sculpture part takes place at eye level, the photo takes place under eye level. So you can see it's purposeful, and this is a trend that goes on, is where he sets up either scenes that are taken below eye level, and it creates this different effect on his work, where it's not, if you go to see it in person, it's not what you see, it's not the same experience as he's in the picture, and he creates this different experience for people who see it in print versus people who see it in person. Now, I'm not saying that neither is better or worse, I'm just saying that it's different, and it's a really interesting concept. Now, the use of photography at this time really gets his name out, where and eventually getting the Eye of Greenberg also helps, where he actually does become noticed internationally. So moving forward to his work in 1953, it's not necessarily his late works, it's more his mid-works, as he dies in 1965 in an automobile accident. Here we see his, from left to right, Tank Totem 3 and Tank Totem 4. Around this time we see a shift in David Smith's work. In the 1940s, he seemed very hopeful. He wrote several articles talking about his desire for collaboration in terms with architecture and really being a group or a community in the terms of art and sculpture and making work for public spaces. However, there's a shift in about 1950 where he realizes that this can't be the case. Public spaces get commercialized, public art gets commercialized, architecture is commercialized, and it becomes a very, company says, own does this. And he expresses his feeling that he can't be a part of that community as a sculpture artist, and he uses his work and the way that he does his pictures as a way to express this discontent that he has found himself in. This is also a great example of how before we saw a one-on-one piece, now we see the an example of these group pictures, and he does a series of these images spreading his work. Here they're on a dock, and it's a very contrasting image. When we think water and dock, the most metal we get is on a boat, something that will float. But these metal sculptures are obviously something that will not float. They are made of sheared ends of boiler tanks, welded iron rods, and other scraps and cuts of metal. And they're made in a way that we see that these will not float. The first one, Tank Totem 3, seems to be kind of flirting with that edge of the dock and almost threatening itself to fall in. And it creates this kind of distress in the viewer, or this anxiety, where the way that he lays out these images and moves these pieces around is almost described as figural and resolute, and with animation and both abstract work, and stirs up questions of figuration and abstraction. But he never says, oh, these are representational images of this and that. And it creates this lucidity where it's for the viewer to see what they will see and so forth, keeping with the abstraction that Greenberg is so fond of, and doesn't necessarily force his medium to be anything but his medium. However, it's always discussed about seeing representationalization in his work. Here we also see a different way he approaches his medium with different elements, different found objects, and how he really works with the found objects for what they are, shipping them found objects or found objects, and he works with them and combines them to create new shapes. Here in this next image, we see from left to right bicycle, which is the small one. The small one all the way on the left. Tank Totem 3 again, and then Tank Totem 4 again. Now, David Smith introduces bicycle, which he also created in 1953, to add a comparison of height. I noticed in his work the way he takes the photographs below eye level can be very misleading on how big or small his pieces actually are, especially in his imaging, and it's a very unique style. This also shows how I'm talking about when he will take groups of objects and kind of pair them off and introduce other ones and explore the different pieces in the setting to express his art and his emotions through this art. Still keeping with the previous one where you get this contrasting scene, bicycles really close to the edge. I can't tell how far Tank Totem 4 is close to the end of the dock, and Tank Totem 3 seems to be the steadiest on the most solid ground. Can be pretty nerve-wracking. Something different than if you were to see it in person. It would probably be in a different setting. These are all in museums and collections now in different settings. So these photographs really provide a different experience for viewers of his work. It's mentioned in interviews with his daughters and different articles how he was happiest seeing his artwork in the open air, and when his daughters see his work in different shows and exhibitions where they do feature them in open air, that they feel that it's where they belong and that he would be happy to see them in that scenario. So it's interesting to think about seeing these photographs. It really shows how we see art and how they are collected in museums versus how the artist intends them to be seen and viewed in the atmosphere that they want the art to have, versus what art critics or collectors will force upon the art to make the art fit the space, not the space fit the art. And it's important to keep that in mind when we appreciate these artworks, that we might not be seeing them in the same light that the artist intended, especially so much later. So fast forward a couple years, and we see a photograph of, from left to right again, Forging 4, Forging 3, Forging 1, unfinished, Untitled, Forging 9, Forging 11, Construction in Rectangles, Forging 2, and Construction with Forged Neck. Now, the structures that are titled Forging were created with a hammering and punching hot lengths of steel using an industrial power forge. While construction with forged neck and construction in rectangles were made by welding different parts together. So you have this these contrasting techniques in one image. And I understand that just in this picture alone there's more than 4 objects, but I really feel that the image alone is its own piece instead of looking at these as individual pieces. With the way that David Smith photographs his work, while these have been long separated and collected, and they can be viewed separately, but I really feel that the way that he does these, each photograph that is published seems to be standalone. This really highlights this technique because looking at this, these look super tall. They look like they could be skyscrapers. It appears that these are towering over the trees that surround them, and in reality the tallest one is about 7.5 feet tall. In contrast to everything else is around the height, if not a little bit taller than the average human. Untitled, which is the shortest one, could stand about the height of a child. Now, looking at this piece, it's been described to as if the viewer has come in on a tense scene. But the way that he has constructed these, it lacks the fleshy figuralness, and keeps true to the abstractness that Greenberg talks. And Greenberg later writes an article and publishes it in 1956 on David Smith. I feel like here David Smith has really embraced sculpture and the material for what it is, and it could be seen that whether it was personal growth or the inner turmoil, where he's going for more and more of a stark contrast between nature and this industrial aesthetic that we talked about, the turmoil earlier, or it can be influenced by the ideals of Greenberg. Either way, David Smith still embraces the idea that his pieces should belong in the open air. In later works, he keeps a trend with the flatness of the works that we see here. It's important to know in Sarah Hamhill's article that she describes that the sculptor gave visual form to what he described as an impossibility of belonging in the post-war era, and the failure of public sculpture to claim to monumentality, where he felt that public sculpture should have been this monumental thing, but it kind of got shirked away as companies began really commercializing architecture in public spaces. And it's pointed out that his photographs are not meant to be nostalgic. They're meant to establish uneasy relationships between objects and their surroundings. And especially in the images that we saw where the pieces were by the dog, it's very evident that he does that quite Obviously, we see this in art later where sculptors and other artists really push to include their objects in the real world and do this contrast to send their message through. And overall, he is described as one of the most influential artists of the 20th century, and how he really saw the tools of industrialization through welding. As was stated earlier, he was the first sculptor to weld and use that sustainably as a sculpting technique. And now today we think of it as obvious, when back then it was not, and I feel that is a key moment for him as an artist. Thank you for listening to my talk about David Smith, and I hope you have a wonderful day.